Hello and welcome. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders fall. Let the room settle around you. This is Boring History for Sleep, where we don't rush, we don't dramatize. We just drift slowly through the quiet corners of the past. Tonight, we're traveling back into a world of silk ribbons, nervous vows, and candlelit ceremonies. A world where marriages were made not just for love, but for land, for legacy, and sometimes for reasons no one fully understood. This is why medieval weddings were so strange, and more. So before we begin, I invite you to make yourself comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Set your phone on silent, and if you can, slip on your headphones. Let the rest of the world fade. And if you're here to fall asleep, you're in the right place. If you're here just to listen, that's lovely too. Tell me in the comments, what time are you watching this? Is it late at night? Just after work? Or while drifting? I always love knowing. Now, let's slip quietly into the past and walk slowly, step by step, toward a very strange, very medieval wedding. In a small manor house, somewhere in 14th century England, the morning began long before the sun had fully risen. The walls, made of timber and plaster, creaked softly in the cold. Firewood crackled in the hearth. A marriage was about to take place, one agreed upon months or even years ago, and nearly every member of the household had a role to play. The bride was perhaps 14. This was not unusual. Marriages among the landed classes were often arranged when children were barely old enough to ride. Today, she would be handed from one household to another, from daughter to wife, not just in name but in law. Her wedding dress was not white. White in the medieval mind symbolized purity, but it was not the customary color for weddings. Instead, she wore blue, a shade long associated with the Virgin Mary. The dress had been stitched by hand, lined with wool, and decorated with simple embroidery, flowers, vines, small symbols of fertility. Before dressing, her maidservant warmed water over a small fire and brought it to her in a bronze basin. The bride washed only her face and hands. Full body bathing was rare in the winter and even rarer before dawn. Her hair was combed and woven into tight braids, then wrapped in a delicate veil, scented with dried lavender and rosemary. Weddings in the medieval world were not only religious, but legal. Before God, yes, but also before witnesses and before society. A marriage was valid not because of a grand ceremony, but because it was declared publicly, witnessed, and, critically, consummated. This wedding would take place at the door of the village church. That too was the custom. The priest would meet the couple outside, just before the entrance. Vows were spoken under the open sky, within sight of neighbors and family, a public acknowledgement of the union. The village church stood at the edge of the manor lands, surrounded by bare trees and early frost. Its stone walls had seen centuries pass. Chickens scratched at the base of the apse, and smoke from nearby cottages drifted quietly upward. Beneath a gray, colorless sky, people began to gather, not for mass, but for matrimony. Medieval weddings, unlike their modern descendants, did not begin with a procession down a central aisle. In most cases, the vows were not spoken inside the church at all. Instead, the couple met at the church porch, the parvis, a threshold space between sacred and secular. This symbolic setting allowed the couple to pledge themselves in public, surrounded by community witnesses, before stepping into the house of God for a blessing. The groom arrived in a tunic of dark wool, fastened with a silver brooch gifted by his uncle. His hair was trimmed neatly, a detail more significant than it appeared, for cleanliness and presentability were markers of worthiness. At his side stood his kin, solemn and well-dressed for the occasion, though their cloaks carried the scent of horses and damp wood. The bride arrived shortly after, escorted by her father and a small group of women from her household. She wore her blue gown, a veil pinned delicately over her braids, and a pair of soft leather shoes prepared for the walk. Her hands held a cloth pouch, inside it, herbs for scent and a coin for luck. At the door of the church, the priest waited in his vestments. He carried a small book bound in dark leather, a taper of beeswax, and a narrow length of cloth to bind the couple's hands, a symbolic gesture now known as hand fasting. Though the term would not become widely used until later centuries. The priest opened the ceremony not with music but with Latin prayer, a psalm spoken softly, a passage from Corinthians. He asked the couple to declare their intent, if they had come freely, without coercion. Though arranged marriages were common, consent still formed the foundation of sacramental union. Then came the exchange of vows. They were brief, legalistic, and absolute. I take thee to my wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse. No rings were exchanged in every case, though some wealthier families included them. A simple band of hammered brass or twisted silver might be slipped onto the bride's finger, not as a display of love, but as a token of property and promise. The priest then took the long cloth and wrapped it once around their joined hands. This was the binding, literal and symbolic, that marked the moment of union. And just like that, they were married. There was no kiss, no applause, only murmured Latin and the echo of footsteps as the couple entered the dark interior of the church, not as strangers, but as husband and wife. The church was cold. Its stone floor had absorbed centuries of chill. Thin light spilled through narrow stained glass windows, not the vibrant, painted rose windows of later cathedrals, but simpler panes, colored only faintly in deep blues and browns. Dust hung motionless in the air. The newlywed couple stood before the altar. Now that the vows had been spoken, the priest began the nuptial mass. It was not required in every region or social class, but where it took place, it marked the marriage as not merely a legal act, but a spiritual one. This was marriage not just between two households, but before heaven. Among the nobility, and even in some village traditions, a wedding was not considered fully valid until the couple had shared a bed. This act, the consummation, was necessary in both canon and civil law. Without it, a marriage could be annulled. In some regions, the bedding was treated as a public ceremonial event. Guests would escort the couple to their chamber, laughing, singing, or offering lewd jokes. In others, it was a quiet ritual, marked only by a small procession and the blessing of the bed. A local midwife or female relative might sprinkle the sheets with herbs, marjoram, chamomile, and rue. A servant placed a warmed brick beneath the furs. Another hung a small cross above the doorway. Then the newlyweds were helped out of their garments, often not by one another, but by their attendants. Once beneath the covers, the priest might re-enter to say one final prayer. In some cases, he remained in the room until the couple were fully settled in bed. Sometimes, a symbolic item, a slipper, a knife, a ring, was placed under the pillow, meant to protect the couple from spirits or misfortune. And then, the chamber door was closed. In the silence that followed, a new life had begun, not of passion, but of partnership, sometimes between strangers, often between the unwilling. But it was done. The union, strange by modern standards, had been fully enacted, legal, sacramental, and witnessed. By morning, the air was colder still. Frost had crept inside the glassless panes of the manor hall. The smoke from the hearths hung low, and the sound of cattle being moved to pasture echoed from the far edge of the village. The wedding guests, who had stayed the night in various lofts, sheds, and stables, began to stir. Some had slept on straw pallets. Others had not slept at all. There were aching heads, muddy shoes, and spilled wine to account for. But in the chamber, above the hall, wrapped in furs and woolen blankets, lay the newlyweds. A pitcher of water sat by the bedside, a small round of bread, a wax-sealed token from the bride's mother, set quietly on the bench near the door. The bedding had been witnessed, not directly in most cases, but indirectly confirmed by ritual. The sheets might be displayed the next morning, or stained cloths examined by senior women of the household. If consummation had not occurred, there could be legal implications, especially if land or inheritance was involved. But if all had gone as expected, the couple would be served a morning meal of bread, honey, and warm milk. Sometimes they were given a coin to tuck under the pillow or into the bride's girdle for fertility and fortune. The feast was a separate ritual. In some traditions, it followed immediately after the bedding. In others, it was held the next day, or even delayed by a full week, especially if travel was required. It took place in the main hall, long, high-roofed, and smoky. Rushes covered the floor, scented with rosemary or sweetgrass to mask the smells of dogs and damp wood. The tables were rough-hewn planks, supported by trestles and lined with woolen blankets instead of cloths. Guests arrived wearing their best garments, linen undertunics, woolen cloaks, fur-lined hoods. Their hands were washed with rose water or herbs at the door. Children ran beneath the benches. Hounds circled the cook fires, waiting for scraps. Food was prepared for days in advance. Whole pigs dressed with apples, stews of barley, leeks, and onions, roasted birds, including partridges and swans, their feathers reattached for show, thick black bread, spiced wine, almond milk. And for those of higher rank, imported delicacies, figs, saffron, and candied quince. There were no individual plates. Most food was shared on trenchers, slabs of hardened bread, and eaten with knives and fingers. A servant might carry a bowl of salt down the center of the table. To sit near it was a sign of honor. To sit far from it was not. Entertainment came in waves, musicians with viols and pipes, jongleurs juggling apples or knives, and storytellers reciting tales of saints, beasts, or ancient kings. In wealthier homes, dancers might perform. In poorer ones, the music alone would suffice. The newlyweds sat together at the high table, flanked by their families. Their faces remained solemn. Even in joy, there was decorum. The feast could last many hours. Sometimes, it stretched into the next day. And by its end, the marriage was not only consecrated by vows and bedding, but by food, song, and the laughter of the community. Beneath the solemn surface of medieval marriage, the vows, the feast, the bedding, there stirred a world of rituals and superstitions. Though rarely written into law, they lingered in the habits of villages, abbeys, and courtly circles alike. And while many were quiet gestures, others were startling, even odd. In parts of France and England, it was once common to break a piece of bread over the bride's head. This act, though seemingly crude, was believed to bring fertility. Guests would scramble for the crumbs, hoping for luck in love, or even in harvest. The richer the bread, the better the omen. A maiden's hair was rarely cut, and on her wedding day, it carried layered meanings. Loose hair signified virginity, while braided or covered hair marked transition into womanhood. In many households, older women would gently plait charms into the bride's hair. Threads of red wool, sprigs of rue, or tiny pins in the shape of crosses. These were meant to protect her from bad dreams and jealous spirits. Salt, rare and precious, held both culinary and spiritual power. A small pouch of it might be hung near the bedpost on the wedding night. In some regions, salt was sprinkled at the threshold of the newlyweds' chamber to ward off curses, envy, or the evil eye. It was said that if a cat sneezed in the house on a wedding morning, it was a sign of lasting love. But if a dog howled at night, especially if it faced the door, the marriage would be short or troubled. Swallows nesting near the home brought luck. Crows circling overhead were a darker sign. The bride's girdle, a belt of fabric, leather, or braided silk, held potent symbolism. It marked her chastity, her household status, and often contained herbs or coins stitched into its lining. It was sometimes removed ceremonially by the husband, though in more modest homes it remained unwitnessed and private. Girdles were embroidered with Latin prayers, or charms in the form of snakes, keys, or saints. Beneath the mattress, small items were often placed before the bedding ceremony. A wooden spoon, symbolizing nourishment, a silver thimble for diligence, or even a child's shoe as a prayer for fertility. These acts were rarely discussed aloud. They were simply done, inherited by memory, performed by instinct. In some northern regions, the bride's veil, especially if it was passed down through generations, was briefly laid near the hearth fire after the wedding. If the cloth curled toward the flames, it meant the bride would bear children. If it recoiled or remained still, the house would know hardship. These were not laws. They were not doctrine. They were shadows of belief, the subtle rituals of a world still ruled by nature, uncertainty, and divine mystery. In them, one finds the echo of an age where a marriage was not merely a private bond, but a thread woven into the vast and trembling tapestry of the cosmos. To understand marriage in the medieval world is not to find romance in the modern sense, but to find meaning, layered deep in custom and covenant. A medieval wedding was never just a celebration of love. It was a transaction, a passage, a vow between families as much as between individuals. And yet, within its rigid boundaries, there was still tenderness, quiet moments, shared bread, the gentle weaving of a braid, the scent of herbs tucked into cloth, the hush of voices in a candlelit chamber. These were not laws. They were not doctrine. They were shadows of belief, the subtle rituals of a world still ruled by nature, uncertainty, and divine mystery. In them, one finds the echo of an age where a marriage was not merely a private bond, but a thread woven into the vast and trembling tapestry of the cosmos. To understand marriage in the medieval world is not to find romance in the modern sense, but to find meaning, layered deep in custom and covenant. A medieval wedding was never just a celebration of love. It was a transaction, a passage, a vow between families as much as between individuals. And yet, within its rigid boundaries, there was still tenderness, quiet moments, shared bread, the gentle weaving of a braid, the scent of herbs tucked into cloth, the hush of voices in a candlelit chamber. And then it vanishes. As the feast ends and the chamber doors close and the fire burns low, a new day begins. Not with music, not with joy, but with bread, labor, and another walk across the frost. In medieval Europe, marriage was rarely a matter of personal affection. It was negotiation, alignment, wealth redistribution, a treaty in cloth and coin. The dowry, a familiar term now, often misunderstood, was not simply a gift. It was currency. It represented the bride's worth, not in love, but in cattle, cloth, or silver. In Italy, dowries could include entire vineyards. In the Low Countries, bolts of dyed wool. In rural France, a single cow might mean everything. Among the nobility, these exchanges grew enormous. Land changed hands. Castles changed ownership. The union of two people might prevent war or ignite one. In 1290, the death of the child bride Margaret of Norway, who was to marry Edward of England, destabilized claims to the Scottish throne for decades to follow. Not all dowries were material. Some came in the form of promises, royal favor, military support, ecclesiastical leniency. These abstract dowries often proved more fragile than gold. And always, they were recorded, on parchment, in Latin, signed by clerics, sealed in wax. A marriage at its heart was a contract. In smaller villages, the logic remained. A father might offer a pig, a good field, or a set of hand-forged tools. In exchange, he expected his daughter would be well kept, protected, and, critically, fertile. Romance, when it appeared, was accidental and often unwelcome. Throughout the Middle Ages, love had boundaries. To cross them was to invite punishment, scandal, or exile. Canon law dictated who could marry whom. Blood relations within the seventh degree were forbidden. Marrying without parental consent could lead to annulment. Secret unions, once discovered, were grounds for disgrace. But still, they happened. One of the most striking examples comes from the 12th century. Peter Abelard and Heloise. Abelard, a brilliant philosopher, and Heloise, his young student and niece of a powerful cleric, fell into forbidden love. Their affair led to a secret marriage, a child born out of wedlock, and, eventually, brutal retribution. Abelard was forcibly castrated. Heloise entered a convent. Their letters survive to this day, quiet, aching echoes of a love too dangerous to exist. Even among peasants, illicit love posed risks. Hand-fasting, a private vow exchanged between lovers without witnesses, was common in parts of England and Scotland. Though not always legally binding, these unions could muddy inheritance claims, spark feuds, or bring ecclesiastical punishment. There are tales of young women fleeing over moors, men fined for stealing kisses, and entire families torn apart over unapproved courtships. In some regions, singing love songs at a window could be seen as grounds for forced marriage or imprisonment. To marry against custom was to risk everything, yet some did it anyway, and their names, mostly, were lost. Among the upper ranks of medieval society, betrothals often occurred before the children could even speak. In 1380, Isabeau of Bavaria was promised to the future Charles VI of France when she was just a teenager. Their marriage was sealed not by choice, but by dynastic interest. Isabeau would become queen consort, and later scapegoated during her husband's mental decline, accused of decadence, treason, and worse. Even more startling was the arrangement involving Richard II of England and Isabella of Valois. He was 29, she was 6. The union was political, a truce between England and France, and though not consummated, it stood as a chilling testament to how little age mattered when kingdoms were at stake. These child brides were often raised by their future in-laws, taught their husband's language, trained in etiquette, obedience, and fertility. Sometimes they were widowed before they reached adolescence. Sometimes they married again and again. Among the peasantry, betrothals were more flexible, but still strategic. A father might pledge his child's hand to a neighbor's son to resolve a feud, to secure grazing rights, or to combine modest inheritances. In each case, the will of the child mattered little. What mattered was position, land, alliance, and so marriages were sealed not with passion, but with parchment, not with roses, but with rye. By the 12th century, marriage was no longer just a social contract. It had become something more, a sacrament. The Church, once merely a witness to unions, now claimed authority over them. Through councils, canon law, and ecclesiastical courts, it reshaped the very meaning of marriage, transforming it from a family arrangement into a spiritual covenant. Pope Alexander III, ruling in the mid-1100s, declared that marriage required only two things: the free consent of both parties and consummation. If both existed, the union was valid in the eyes of God, whether or not it had been blessed by clergy, witnessed, or publicly announced. This terrified nobles. It upended centuries of custom. It meant that a secret vow, spoken at night beneath an elm tree, could be as binding as a grand church ceremony. It meant that a lord's daughter, if married quietly to a stable boy and joined in flesh, could not be lawfully reclaimed. Though divorce as we know it did not exist under Catholic doctrine, annulments did. And they were granted not for suffering, but for technicalities, for absence of consent, for spiritual kinship, for consummation never completed. And so, behind monastery walls and cathedral chancelleries, trials were held, slow, meticulous, and utterly silent to the outside world. A couple seeking annulment would be summoned. Sometimes they arrived hand in hand. Sometimes they refused even to speak to one another. Witnesses were called, maids, brothers, former lovers, wet nurses. Their testimony was taken in Latin, every word written by a cleric's careful hand. One of the most common grounds for annulment was consanguinity, blood relation too close to be lawful. In the early medieval period, the Church prohibited marriage within 7 degrees of kinship, calculated by the number of generations to a common ancestor. It was an impossible standard for the nobility. Everyone was related. Kings, counts, barons, all tangled in the same ancestral web. And so, the Church offered dispensations, but only at a price. More obscure was spiritual kinship. If a man had been godfather to a woman's child, or had shared a baptismal sponsor with her, their marriage could be declared spiritually incestuous. Even if the couple had lived together for decades, had children, shared property, the bond could be severed. These rulings were not always cruel. Sometimes they offered protection. Women trapped in dangerous unions could appeal to canon law. If a bride had been forced, or deceived, or wed before puberty, she could, in theory, seek annulment. But the cost was high, and the process slow. To annul a union, one had to prove it was never valid, that consent had been absent, that the bodies had never joined, that the words had been spoken under duress, or that a prior betrothal, even if long forgotten, still held power. In one preserved record, a man claimed he had once promised to marry a woman while drunk at a feast 15 years earlier. The court deliberated for months. They ruled in favor of the earlier vow. In another case, a bride accused her husband of impotence. 2 midwives were summoned. The man was examined. Cloth was burned to test his reaction. He failed. The marriage was annulled. It was a strange world, soft-spoken, sacred, and quietly brutal. The Church, for all its mystery, left detailed traces, and in its ledgers and trial scrolls, we see not saints or sinners, but ordinary people, caught between law and longing, struggling to understand what bound them and what could set them free. In the medieval mind, the body was never alone. Every act, from work to worship, from hunger to desire, echoed through the soul. And so too did marriage. Once joined, a couple entered a sacred realm of shared sin and salvation. Their bodies became one flesh, but their souls became one burden, one trial, one path to heaven or to penance. It was the priest who stood between them and damnation, and it was through confession that the weight of union was measured. Confession, by the 13th century, had become a regular sacrament, expected at least once per year. For married couples, it could be delicate. A priest might ask questions not only of spiritual nature, but of carnal life. Had the couple refused one another in bed? Had they sought pleasure outside the marriage? Had they dishonored their vows through cruelty, withholding, or excess? In these dark wooden confessionals, sometimes built into the walls of stone churches, sometimes spoken quietly under trees or behind chapel screens, men and women poured out their fears. Some confessed jealousy, others indifference. Still others wept over coldness they could not name. The penance varied: prayer, alms, pilgrimage, silence. Contrary to modern expectation, even married couples were expected to abstain from intercourse during certain times of the year, over 100 days, by some reckonings. No coupling during Lent, none during Advent, none on feast days or in the 3 days leading up to communion. To break these rules knowingly could be cause for confession or public humiliation if discovered. Penance might include fasting, kneeling in ash, or walking barefoot to the altar with a cord around the neck. And yet, most of these acts were quiet, unseen, felt only between two people and the church that watched over them. Despite its harshness, the church also offered comfort. It promised that marriage, though fraught, was a path to grace. A husband who treated his wife with care was said to mirror Christ. A wife who bore children and suffered well was likened to the saints. Their union was a small monastery, not of solitude, but of endurance. Marriage was not a reward, it was a refinement. And those who bore it with dignity, who forgave, who confessed, who endured, would be rewarded, not with peace on earth, but with rest in the world to come. Among kings and queens, a wedding was never simply a joining of hearts. It was war, paused by a parchment. A daughter sent like a letter, a ring offered as ransom. Medieval monarchs did not marry for love. They married to end hostilities, to claim lands, or to forge temporary peace between rivals who might, in a year's time, return to the battlefield. When Henry II of England married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, it was not a love story, it was a political lightning strike. Eleanor, recently divorced from the King of France, brought with her a vast inheritance, land stretching across southern France. Their union created an empire that terrified the French crown. Love had nothing to do with it. Likewise, when Margaret Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, was wed to James IV of Scotland, it was meant to seal a truce between two long-warring nations. The truce did not last, but the marriage laid the foundation for the eventual union of the English and Scottish crowns a century later. These royal unions were acts of high diplomacy. The bride was a symbol. Beautiful, yes, but above all, valuable. She was escorted by hundreds, her dowry transported in guarded carriages, and her departure often permanent. For many royal brides, marriage meant exile. The streets were swept, the stones sprinkled with petals. The bells rang for hours, not in joy, but in warning. For a royal wedding was not a private affair. It was a procession of order, carefully watched, meant to echo in both memory and history. At the center was the bride. Her gown was not white. That tradition would not take hold until many centuries later. Instead, she wore cloth of gold, or deep crimson, or a mantle lined with stoat fur and decorated with pearls. Jewels traced the neckline. Her headdress shimmered with enamel. Around her waist, a girdle of gemstones. Her shoes were carved leather, rarely touched by the ground. Surrounding her, dozens of women, chosen from noble families, each wearing livery to match the bride's. They held small bouquets, not of roses, but of rosemary, myrtle, and rue, herbs of purity and memory. Behind them, knights on horseback, clergy in embroidered vestments, pages carrying banners, trumpeters sounding long, mournful notes into the early sky. The groom arrived separately, often cloaked in velvet or brocade, his gloves perfumed, his sword gilded. His armor, if ceremonial, was polished to mirror finish. He walked not alone, but with his heralds and guards. Some weddings even featured jesters, costumed huntsmen, and trained animals led in chains of silver. The ceremony took place beneath a canopy of fabric, sometimes erected outdoors if weather allowed. Cloth of gold backdrops shimmered like water in sunlight. Latin prayers echoed, then drowned in the sound of clapping and bells. At the feast, thousands were served. Tables groaned under meats sculpted to resemble mythical beasts. Singers performed in 4 languages. Even the pies sang, for live birds were sometimes baked inside and released as a trick of courtly wonder. The marriage itself, often still arranged, often still fragile, but the performance, it was flawless, and long after the union had withered, or unraveled, or ended in blood, the wedding itself would remain in memory, gilded, untouchable, eternal. Once the music faded and the cloaks were hung in cedar chests, the queen's real work began. To be married into royalty was not to ascend. It was to become a vessel for dynasty. Her value was not in her beauty, though that was paraded, nor in her mind, though it might be brilliant. It was in her womb, and it was there, in that quiet, private space, that the future of kingdoms was decided. In nearly every royal household, the queen was expected to bear sons, not simply children, but male heirs, strong enough to inherit titles, lands, armies. Daughters were tolerated, sons were essential, and each month that passed without pregnancy was counted. Whispers would gather, midwives consulted, prayers offered. Tensions rose in rooms where no one spoke. Herbs were taken, baths drawn, tokens worn beneath chemises. And when a child was finally born, if male, the court would erupt in ceremony. If not, the queen might find herself isolated, sometimes accused of sorcery, sometimes of infidelity, sometimes simply of being unlucky. Some queens, like Catherine of Aragon, would suffer repeated miscarriages, each more public than the last. Others, like Anne of Bohemia, bore no children at all, and spent years in silent prayer, caught between royal expectation and the divine. Even when children were born, the queen's role did not lessen. She was expected to intercede in court affairs, to soften the king's decisions, to arrange further marriages, to act as a diplomat in silk and ink. Her chambers became an alternate court, where nobles sought favor, gifts, or mercy. But she held no true power, only influence. And influence, like beauty, could fade. In many regions, queens had no property of their own. Their jewels were lent to them, their dowry lands managed by stewards. If widowed, they might be exiled, or remarried for strategy once more. Only a few, the exceptional, carved their own place in history. Most disappeared into silence, remembered only for whose mother they were. ... or whose son they failed to bear. The wedding feast had ended. The candles burned down to wax stubs. The guests departed, leaving gifts, bolts of silk, gold coins, relics from distant shrines. But for the royal bride, the pageantry was far from over. Her new life began with silence, ritual, and carefully choreographed display. If the queen soon became pregnant, as was hoped, expected, and often prayed for, she entered what was known as confinement. Around the 7th month, she was secluded in a private chamber, prepared with holy images, relics, and rich fabrics. Tapestries were hung to soften sound and shadow. The windows were shuttered. No men were allowed, save a priest and her physician. Sometimes, even the light was filtered through linen, to protect the unborn child from the outside world. This period could last 40 days or more. Inside, she was attended by midwives and noble ladies, read to by clerics, rubbed with oils, fed carefully from silver spoons. Outside her chamber, candles burned continuously. A herald might be stationed nearby, awaiting the moment of birth, to proclaim the sex of the child before it had taken its first breath. And if the birth went wrong, as it often did, the silence could stretch for days. Not every queen was crowned. It was a privilege, not a guarantee. To be crowned was to be anointed, touched by holy oil, robed in majesty, and given a kind of sacral authority that no ordinary noblewoman could claim. When the coronation did occur, it was often weeks or months after the wedding. The queen would be led through city streets beneath a canopy of silk, her garments stitched with symbols of purity and grace. She would pass beneath carved arches, greeted by children bearing flowers, and climb the steps of a cathedral, heavy with incense. There, before bishops and barons, She would be crowned not with gold alone, but with expectation, a wife, a mother, a peacemaker. If she was foreign-born, the coronation helped bind her to the land. If she was beloved, it affirmed her in the people's eyes. If not, it was a formality, quietly endured. Even in her private life, the queen was never alone. Her household, appointed by her husband's court, watched her closely. Letters were copied, visitors recorded. Her bedchamber was staffed by noblewomen, chosen not for affection, but for political reliability. And all around her, ritual framed her life. How she dressed, when she appeared, what she ate, every gesture, ceremonial. Even her daily walks might be guided by court protocol. How many steps, how many attendants, how many witnesses? In gilded silence, she moved like a figure in a tapestry, beautiful, controlled, fragile. Not every royal marriage was celebrated in memory. Some were whispered about only in shadows. Some became curses, wrapped in silks and sealed with broken rings. In these unions, love was not the casualty. Power was. In 1308, Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV, married Edward II of England. The wedding was a spectacle, her dowry immense. She was 12 years old. But from the beginning, the union was fractured. Edward's affection lay elsewhere, with his favorite, Piers Gaveston, a man hated by the nobles. Isabella, humiliated, watched as her husband gave away her jewels to another man. Years later, she would rise against him. In secret alliance with her lover, Roger Mortimer, she led a rebellion. Edward II was captured, imprisoned, allegedly murdered in the most gruesome of ways. Isabella ruled briefly as regent. Her son, Edward III, just a boy. But power, once seized, began to rot. She was overthrown, locked in a tower, her title lost. Her marriage, remembered only in scandal. Marguerite married Louis, King of Navarre, later Louis X of France. But hers was a tale not of betrayal, but of accusation. In 1314, she and her sisters-in-law were accused of adultery, a scandal now known as the Tour de Nesle affair. The evidence? A servant's testimony, a misplaced coin, a veiled glance. Marguerite was imprisoned in the chilling heights of Chateau Gaillard. No trial, no appeal. She died there, possibly strangled. Her royal marriage annulled. Her name erased from court records for years. She had once worn a crown. She died in linen and stone. Though later, in the medieval arc, during England's early modern hinge, Anne Boleyn remains the most iconic caution. Raised at court, married to a king, crowned in splendor, and executed by sword. Her marriage to Henry VIII broke with Rome, redefined succession, and split England's spiritual identity in half. For a time, Anne was everything: grace, wit, promise, hope. But she bore no son, and court whispers grew sharper than daggers. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, likely all false, she was brought to the scaffold in May of 1536. Her marriage ended not in annulment, not in silence, but in steel. Across kingdoms and centuries, these queens shared a fate. They were once symbols of power, piety, beauty. And in the end, they were undone by the very systems they embodied, not by battles, but by protocol, by ceremony, by marriage. When the queen died, the bells tolled for hours. The court wore black. Her chamber was sealed. But even in death, she did not belong to herself. The queen was wrapped in linen, her hair combed, her hands crossed. In some traditions, her entrails were removed, preserved separately, buried in a reliquary beneath a favored altar. Her heart, in rare cases, was encased in silver and carried in procession. The funeral itself was spectacle, a second marriage, this time to the grave. Tapestries were changed from crimson to purple. The bier was draped with heraldry. Monks chanted psalms as her body passed beneath stone arches. If she had borne sons, she was remembered in bronze. If she had ruled wisely, she was praised in eulogy. If she had failed to produce an heir, her memory faded faster. Some queens were entombed beside their husbands. Others were placed in abbeys, far from court. Their bones mingled with dust and wax, their names carved so thin the stone wore smooth within a century. In manuscripts, the queen was painted as grace personified, serene, pale, eyes cast downward, her robes stiff with color, her crown hovering like a golden net. But these images were not likenesses. They were symbols. She became an emblem of dynasty, a mother of kings, a saint of stability. And like all symbols, she could be altered. Later rulers revised her image. Chroniclers softened her flaws, or sharpened them, depending on whose bloodline rose next. Even her letters, if preserved, were often recopied by scribes, their margins trimmed, her voice fading word by word. Today, what remains of these medieval marriages is delicate, a ring unearthed near an old hearth, a seal impression pressed into wax, a prayer book with initials faded from centuries of touch. We walk beneath their portraits in galleries and see only elegance. But beneath the pigments were women, married to nations, bound by protocol, raised on ceremony, and remembered, if at all, by whose air they carried into winter. And now, our long walk through medieval marriage draws to a close. You've been with us through silent ceremonies, strange customs, awkward betrothals, feast halls, and veils made of borrowed lace. Whether you drifted off hours ago, or made it all the way to the end, thank you. Thank you for using this time to rest, to reflect, to slow down. If this helped you sleep, if it helped you breathe just a little more deeply, I'd be so glad to know. Tell me below, what time were you watching this? And what part stayed with you, even in the quiet? And if this journey brought you comfort, don't forget to like or subscribe for more stories like this, slow, soft, and just strange enough to dream on. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams tonight be filled with candlelight, carved stone, and distant echoing bells. Good night.